Welcome to the Ayaan Hirsi podcast, a home for critical thinking and common sense. Today, Michael Shellenberger is joining me for the second time. He was one of my favorite guests, and I'm delighted to have him back on. Michael is the founder and president of Environmental Progress. He has been working as a climate activist for 20 years and as an environmentalist for 30. He was Time magazine's Hero of the Environment in 2008. The last time he joined me, we discussed his book, Apocalypse Never. He now has a new book out titled Fransicko, which looks at issues such as the rise of crime and homelessness in progressive round cities. Michael, thank you very much for joining me again. It's always a delight to talk to you. On this podcast, I plan to talk to you about Fransicko, your new book, but then all sorts of things started to unfold, current events like the election outcome in Virginia and the one, I think it's still a tie in New Jersey, New York, and other places. And then there's also Glasgow, and there's a lot of stuff going on there. So bear with me. Let me just ask you your opinion on the following. So we have a governor in New Virginia who is a Democrat and who could have easily held onto his seat. And in fact, we thought that was the case for a long time. He loses that election to a person I've actually never heard of before, and I don't think I followed local politics in Virginia before. But now that I do, the people who elected this new governor and who set off the old one did it for a number of reasons, but the most important one that's highlighted today is education. What's your take on it?
Yeah, well, it's great to be back, Ayaan. Wonderful to be with you. And yeah, it's my book, really both books, Apocalypse Never and Fransicko, Why Progressives Ruin Cities, had a lot to say about what just happened, this upset in Virginia. Of course, it's a state where the Democratic governor should have been elected. It's been trending Democratic. I believe Biden won with over 10 percentage points, don't quote me, but he won by a significant margin just a year ago. And the election ended up turning on this issue of critical race theory, which, as you know, is this idea that racism is the most important issue in American life, that people of different races are essentially different from one another. It contains a story about victimology, which is that, all Black people are victims, essentially, all white people are privileged, essentially, and that to victims, everything, and to oppressors, nothing. It's very similar to what I'm arguing against in Fransicko. And you could see that in the elections, it played out more in the realm of schooling, which is, where the Republican candidate said, we got to get this terrible racist ideology out of our schools. And the response from the governor was twice bad. It was three. He said, first, there is no such thing as critical race theory. It's not being taught in the schools. That's just not true. The second thing he said was parents shouldn't be involved in schooling or involved in their children's classroom. So I think that I'm writing this piece called Why Progressives Ruin Democrats. It plays on the theme of Fransicko, which is why progressives ruin cities. But basically, my argument is that, the parts of the progressive agenda that are popular tend to have to do with class, not race. And Republicans have done a really good job challenging Democrats on class-based concerns, since the Trump revolution of 2016. But they've let this just sort of hyper-racial moral panic, along with victimology, really take over what it means to be a progressive and what it means to be a Democrat. And the implications of that, of course, are absolutely extraordinary, because it means that we're in the midst of a major historical political realignment.
And here's the interesting thing. We live in a state, California, where I know a lot of Democrats, and they would agree with absolutely everything you said just now. The Democrats that I see and socialize with and who are my friends, they hate critical race theory. They think that some of these issues that we're facing are actually class-centered and have nothing to do with race. And yet, those very same people continue to vote for the people who are obsessed with race. Is being a member of a political party, or is being, attached to a political party, is that like a tribal feeling?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I live just up the road from you in Berkeley, California.
Yeah.
So I saw the same thing. We're clearly in a really dynamic moment, so things could still change very quickly. California obviously is one of the most progressive states in the country. So in some ways, I would expect things to change here after they change everywhere else. Virginia is a pretty liberal state, but it's not as liberal or left-wing as California is. That being said, just in the last few weeks, we've seen, my book came out 3 weeks ago. It looks like in that time, we see that the district attorney of San Francisco will likely be recalled. Several school board members will likely be recalled, all from the radical left. If the DA goes, then the mayor probably appoints a moderate to be the DA from the city council. The person on the city council as a moderate would be replaced by somebody else who's probably a moderate. You look down the road and you could see San Francisco returning to moderate hands, and LA within 1 or 2 election cycles. Similarly, Democrats are they're going to take a huge loss in a year from now. Almost certainly going to lose control of the Congress, probably lose the presidency in 2024, and Democrats will have to respond. And, this is where I sort of go with this piece, is that it doesn't look good for Democrats, according to their own numbers, if they continue to go down this hyper woke path. There's a very young political consultant named David Shore for the Democrats who's been arguing this for weeks, and it's been out there obviously really since last year, the elections. James Carville has been warning Democrats that this focus on race and culture was really off-putting. I tweeted out last night Van Jones and other CNN correspondents basically just saying openly that Democrats have become annoying, insulting, patronizing, shrill, just everything that we know about how Democrats have become. So Democrats will either have to change or they'll just continue to lose elections. It's just that simple.
I just saw a reaction from Joy Reid to the Virginia election, and she just said the Republican Party is dangerous, and that kind of rhetoric, and you use the word shrill. It's absolutely right. If I were a Democrat, I would say today, we're losing the independents, we're losing Democrats who voted for us, and we're losing Republicans who moved away from the Republican Party because of Trump. And instead of reflecting on why they lost and getting to the bottom of it, they are, from the reactions that I can see on a superficial level, just coming through the media, they're doubling down on it. I just listened to President Biden, who came from Glasgow, and talked again about COVID. And I think talking about COVID and the pandemic, that's a very, very important issue. It's the issue of the day. But his response to why so many elections were lost and elections that shouldn't have been closed are just what you described. It's the denial. It's staying on the woke path, invoking race at every turn.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a question. I mean, I think what's great about politics is that you can live in a delusional bubble for a while, but the great thing is that you'll just lose elections and you'll just lose power. So, and eventually, these things have to correct themselves. I do think, it's interesting to me that the Democrats, basically all what the Democrats have been focused on is all falling apart at the exact same time. So as you mentioned, it's not just that the voters have repudiated this moral panic on race. Americans are, for the most part, not racist. We're less racist than ever. We get insulted when people tell us that we're racist with good reason. So that's all kind of falling apart. At the same time, the climate change stuff is just a joke. I mean, basically Biden in the weeks leading up to the United Nations climate talks in Scotland, he's been pleading with OPEC to produce more oil, even at the same time that he has been, along with the broader Democratic coalition, attacking expanded oil and gas drilling in the United States. The United States over the last 5 years should have been increasing its investment in oil and gas production. It did not, out of a reaction to progressive climate change demands. We should be just having much more. In fact, the whole world would then have more oil and gas because it is a global market. So you see that happening. Then they go to Scotland and they say, oh, we're all going to do stuff. Well, they couldn't even agree to stop financing coal plants, which should have been easy, low-hanging fruit for them. They couldn't even agree to do that. But it doesn't even matter because the conference itself, it's voluntary. It's just public relations. The first day, Biden falls asleep. He gives this terrible press conference that he's just barely coherent in. And then meanwhile, today, I just tweeted out this morning, China announces that it's going to spend $500 billion building more nuclear over the next 15 years than the rest of the world built over the last 35 for reasons that have nothing to do with climate change, because it knows it needs a lot of energy. And by the way, neither President Xi of China or President Putin of Russia bothered even going to UN climate talks. So it's just clear as day, it seems to me, that we're in the midst of an epical shift from a kind of post-Cold War era that lasted about 30 years to whatever the post-Cold War era is, probably some new geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China. But clearly it's the end of this really, I think we're also in the, just about to end a really bad, and we're about to go into a big backlash against all the bad woke racial stuff at the same time.
Yeah, the fascinating thing is that this woke nonsense, it just sabotages everything. You shouldn't expect to be talking about racial justice and all that nonsense. And I don't think that racial injustice is nonsense. I just think that this injecting race into everything, which is what the woke do, that's nonsense. And even on a topic that should be, in my view, free of this stuff, like climate, the environment, or the pandemic, it gets into all of that. One thing you said earlier about the geopolitics, number one, just 20 years ago was 9/11/2001. And when that event happened, terrorists attacked the United States of America, tried to destroy everything that we believe in. One of the key responses was America should never, ever depend on oil from the Middle East again. And the private sector worked very hard to deliver on that, and then we just shut it down. You wrote that in your previous book, and you say that we have the capability of developing nuclear energy, and that can lead us to a clean planet. China's doing it. And China, as you know, is not our best friend. Why are we not doing it? It's the most rational path to take.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy, right? And hopefully China's big push into nuclear, and of course Russia is a major nuclear builder around the world, will force it. We had a big sea change in public opinion. A lot of the progressives, including the people who I argue with on other issues, have become pro-nuclear, but they haven't had the support in their own party for it. But it's the same issues, as we discussed last year. It's just continuing fear of nuclear weapons, but it's also become a big scam. If you have nuclear, you don't need all this renewables. You don't need all this junk, basically. You don't need all this money spent on special interests, on special causes. You just, with natural gas and nuclear, basically the only things that matter when it comes to reducing carbon emissions. If you use nuclear and natural gas, there is no climate problem. So the key is to expand those two things. Well, that's the opposite of what the climate activists want. They actively are campaign against it. They get financing from the big investor banks like BlackRock, and they're in bed with the Chinese solar panel manufacturers. I mean, I think since you and I talked last year, we've seen a series of pretty big events occur. We now know that China has subsidized its solar panels, not just directly with money, but also through the use of coerced Uyghur Muslim labor. We know that the solar panels required the use of the dirtiest form of energy in the form of coal, that the unaccounted for cost of waste, and this is according to a Harvard Business Review study that came out a few months ago, should make electricity from solar 4 times more expensive once that waste is properly accounted for. So the expansion of renewables is also coming to a halt and is in a point of crisis. And as I pointed out, in a recent Substack, the U.S. and the world really invested so much in unreliable weather-dependent renewables and not enough in oil and gas development that the world is now having a massive energy crisis. Petroleum prices are up 60% from where they were in just a year. They're at their highest level in 7 years. We don't have enough gas. And so countries, including the United States, but also China and Europe, are all returning to coal because of the advocacy of climate groups. So I think really progressive ideology is in crisis. And to some extent, I just think the West is in crisis too. I think we can pull out of it, but we've got to get beyond this basically woke religion, which is complete with, an apocalyptic view of climate change and a religious, essentialist, and really pseudoscientific view of race.
Yeah, so I celebrated the outcome of the Virginia election and others because I hope that this means we can get out of it. And when I say I celebrated it, what I mean is the way parents in Virginia felt empowered enough to organize themselves and bring an end to the narrative. The only question is, do you really think we can before we pull out of it, how much damage can we expect?
Well, it's been pretty ugly so far, right? I mean, we've seen I wrote Apocalypse Never in San Francisco go together in the sense that on the one hand, they're totally different. Apocalypse Never argues that most environmental trends are going in the right direction. Most environmental trends are we want to do more of them, more gas, more nuclear. Climate change is not the big threat that we were worried about. I have a piece up today noting that really temperatures are going to probably peak at 2.5 degrees centigrade. Mm-hmm. Well, the UN target had been 2 degrees for 2 decades until they recently changed it to 1.5 degrees. So we're actually on track to not having very much warming. And the big problem is at least in the United States, but certainly in other countries, including Scotland, interestingly enough, is a drug addiction crisis. We had almost 100,000 people die of drug deaths last year. That's an increase from just 17,000 20 years ago. We have a whole generation that is just dying from totally poisonous, heavily intoxicating, addictive drugs. And that's, of course, what's behind, or maybe not of course, but that is what's behind the so-called homelessness problem. So clearly we're having, we're a mess. I mean, big things need to change and they need to change quickly.
Yeah. When you were talking about climate, the phrase that just keeps rolling in my head is that of the cost of living. And if you tie that to the homelessness and the poverty, I see precisely what you mean by how these things are related. And yeah, the outcomes. And I know that when you describe the drug addiction and then behind it, the drug cartels, the fact that actually here in California, we know all this, or the people we've put in power know all this, but then they keep reverting back to this racial injustice meme. And you have to wonder then, with the cost of living going up, gas prices going up, do you think we're going to have more homelessness or less?
Unfortunately, we're going to have significantly more until there's some political change. What I discover in San Francisco is, on the one hand, there's a lot of different causes of what we call homelessness. the word homeless itself is a propaganda word designed to trick our brains into thinking this is just a problem of housing, or that the people that are living in tents on the street or underneath highway underpasses, that they're somehow just poor people. Well, that's absurd. I mean, I think everybody knows these are people who, almost all of whom, at least if they're living unsheltered, are suffering very serious levels of drug addiction and or some other mental illness. You know, the solution is very simple. You have to shelter everybody, require people to stay in the shelters. You can't let people sleep on the streets. You can't let people use drugs and defecate in public. These are not compatible behaviors with civilization. So then the question for me for San Fransicko was just, why don't we do that?
Yeah.
And the bottom line is victim ideology. It's this idea that you can divide people in the world into the category of victims or oppressors, that victims, the state of being a victim is permanent. It's not like in the traditional heroic journey where you're victimized on the way to becoming a hero, such as every Hollywood movie, but also just in those stories we tell about our own lives, you know, when we all suffer. And so the stories that we tell ourselves is, yeah, I got through that hard part and it made me a better person. Well, that's not what victim ideology says. Victim ideology says, by nature of being Black or mentally ill or a woman or an addict, you are a victim. And to victims, we give everything and demand nothing in return. That's what victim ideology requires. So even if you would agree that some people are victims who are on the street, the idea that you just give them cash and a tent and some fresh needles to shoot or smoke drugs with is bonkers. Yeah. But that's the basic idea. Yeah. I'd say the third part of it is just that we then elevate, they, progressives, elevate victims into sort of spiritual beings. Yeah. So it is a kind of victim worship, but it is a kind of worship that maintains their victim status through the policies that we enact relating to them.
It's also a desire to acquire power. So people use this narrative to get to powerful positions. But then when they're in those powerful positions, they just make those problems like, so homelessness or, you know, the mental health issues, the drug addictions, these things get worse and worse with the people who are committed to getting to power through the development of this victim, you call it victimology. And that doesn't bode well for the country, because the other thing that I find disturbing is in San Francisco and in I would say even probably LA, it's homelessness, mental health. These are things that we talk about all the time, and yet these are also problems that I think you lay it out beautifully in your book. That we know, I don't want to say 100% solutions, but we know that there are policies that actually help. And yet those policies are not carried out. And if you could please talk a little bit about your visit to the Netherlands and what you saw as an option, as an alternative, and how much that costs.
Sure. Well, let me just say first what we should do, because it's just clarifying, I think, to sort of contrast what we know works and what we should do with what we're doing in San Francisco. And this is based on, you know, my field work in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, but also interviews with the head of the drug program in Portugal. We looked at basically every civilized nation, every civilized city and state, and looked at how they dealt with it. It's the same thing for everybody. It's basically you have to have enough shelters for people that need them. They have to stay in them. The alternative is not to camp in the streets or the sidewalks. That's just not allowed. People that are suffering from severe mental illness or drug addiction are offered treatment. And if they're arrested breaking laws, then they have the option of getting clean through rehab or going to jail. It's not optional. And then I think the final part of it, and certainly we need, is some sort of universal psychiatric care. So in the Netherlands, they actually have a private insurer model like we have. It's not a single payer system like the French or the Canadians have, but it is universal. It does cover everybody. And that's a similar component of what we need. But what I loved about the Netherlands, and part of the reason I chose it, as the model for California is, we Californians are snobs, and San Franciscans are more snobby than anybody. So I wanted to choose a city that I think is a world-class city. Anybody that's ever been to Amsterdam knows it's a world-class city. It's not, it's about the same size. It's actually bigger than San Francisco. Obviously, California is, bigger. It's huge. California is a bigger economy than Britain's economy. But I wanted to give the example because I did feel like, you could explain to Californians who are very liberal on many things, that look, you can smoke marijuana in Amsterdam. You can hire a sex worker. It's a regulated industry. It's you can bike everywhere.
Yep.
We love biking in the Bay Area. And so I wanted to give that as the model rather than New York or Miami or San Antonio, that have all done good things, but who, if you kind of talk about them, I thought California and San Franciscans would sort of turn their noses up. But that's basically it. I mean, it's slightly different in Portugal, slightly different in Japan, but that's the basic recipe.
And Michael, it's also so that Amsterdam is a progressive run city. The mayor is of the Green Party, Femke Halsema, and has been, as long as I remember, Amsterdam was run by the Social Democratic Party. So progressives there somehow see things differently.
Yeah, similarly to the United States, interestingly, in California, the Netherlands is more conservative than Amsterdam. Like around the world, people that live in cities are just more liberal.
That's right.
More decadent. There's not that more, conservatives tend to be more rural. And so the country of the Netherlands, so the country of the Netherlands is more center right than the city of Amsterdam, which is more left wing. And I think that helped a lot to get the changes they needed, just like I think it would help here. And in fact, we even see a similar dynamic in Texas, where the state of Texas is obviously more conservative than the city of Austin, which is the capital, but it's a very culturally progressive city. Mm-hmm. And basically, the state itself has had to take action to force Austin to deal with its open drug scenes.
Yeah.
Because it had done basically what San Francisco had done, which was just to basically say, oh, anybody can camp anywhere because they're victims. And they've been able to shut that down. So, I mean, that's what basically, just to, fast forward to the end of the book of San Francisco, I basically argue it's going to be much more likely that California becomes a more moderate state and takes action than it is that San Francisco does. And in fact, I don't think this is a problem that can be solved at this city level, in part because street addicts are such a transient population.
Yeah. And they're taking off. The question that keeps popping up is the cost. How much does it cost to get everyone off the streets, provide them with the mental health care they need, provide them with shelters, provide them with an alternative to camping under overpasses and other places that are not fit for human life?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's funny. I after 2 years of research, I still could not get a clear number of how much we spend on this problem. And neither can members of the state legislature. And part of the problem is, for example, how much of the fire department do we spend on homelessness? It's very hard to figure out exactly, but we know that about half of the fires that they put out in Oakland and Los Angeles now are homeless fires, which is really wild when you consider that while there are a lot of homeless, they're not half of the people, right? So you're talking about a huge part of our public services are going to homelessness. We know that we spend more money per capita in California on mental health than any other state. And we obviously have the worst outcomes. So money, if anything, has made the problem worse. In fact, I do argue that it's a consequence of our prosperity, that we've been so decadent and so liberal in our policies. What I would say is part of it, the cost depends on what you're doing. So if you basically are just paying social workers to maintain the lifestyles of drug addicts who don't work and just basically sit in tents all day and do drugs, it can be very expensive. At this point, it's about $100,000 per homeless person in San San Francisco. Wow, having a hard time saying the name of the city. I keep calling it San Francisco. It's very expensive. On the other hand, and there's some people who are more expensive than others. I mean, people with schizophrenia are very difficult. People with schizophrenia with drug addictions, extremely difficult.
Right.
My aunt had schizophrenia. She did well. She lived in a group home in Denver. She never worked. She lived in a house with like 6 other people. That's a good outcome for people with schizophrenia. She did well. There's other people like the 25-year-old kid, young man that gets addicted to heroin and just is living in a tent in San Francisco. That guy, he's probably breaking many laws every day, including shoplifting to sustain his habit, but certainly camping publicly, defecating in public, using drugs publicly. If he were arrested for breaking the law, brought in front of a judge, and the judge mandated rehab and said, look, you got to get rehab. And, it's the rehab. You really want it to be something like 90 days, probably inpatient and probably not in San Francisco. So it'd be more like, under our fantasy California, the guy would be like, okay, I'll take the rehab instead of prison. I'm tired of being a junkie.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a place for him in the countryside somewhere or some suburb. He gets his life together. He gets reconnected with his family. You have a single social worker as opposed to the current mess of a system we have now. There's no reason that within 90 days or 6 months, he could be independent. It's not going to be easy for him. He's probably going to relapse. There's some amount of kind of a sort of case management for him. But if you don't have the stick of prison or jail time as the consequence of him continuing to break the law, then he's very expensive. If you do have it, it's a lot cheaper. So that's not, I know sometimes maybe a totally satisfying answer, but it tells you, I think, what the cost dynamics are specifically.
Yeah, and I think if you add to that the cost of the crime and not the, you've discussed that the crimes committed by people who are addicts and with mental health issues, but the drug cartels, these young men mainly from Latin America, who are organized and who sell the drugs and who want this thing to go on because for them it's a direct profit. That cost is also almost never spoken of.
Absolutely, the societal costs. And how do you put a number on the loss of 10 or 12 drugstores in the last year or two? Drugstores that no longer are available for the community to use, which is what's going on because I don't know, your listeners may not realize, and it's one of the things I described. We passed legislation in 2014 in the same ballot initiative that basically reduces the consequences from a felony to a misdemeanor of theft of $950 worth of goods and 3 grams of hard drugs. So, I mean, it's when you look back on it, you kind of go, oh my gosh, why did we ever think that was a good idea? Yeah. But basically, it allows addicts to go into drugstores, steal $950 worth of items, sell them at a fraction of their cost to be able to buy enough drugs for a couple of days. And then the drugstores, they've been, because of the threat of violence, they order the security guards to let it occur. And then after a certain amount of time, the drugstores, they just can't afford to keep the drugstores open. So Walgreens, Safeway, we see them cutting back hours or just shutting stores entirely, shutting stores in a city that is one of the richest cities in the country and could easily sustain those stores.
Yeah, it's all boils down to what you said, this victimology narrative. If you're a criminal, then it must be because of racism. If public schools are not providing that service as they should, then the standards of education are lowered. And all this nonsense about race is introduced into them. If we have 1 or 2 problems, but very minor problems with our police force, we go out and say, defund the whole thing. I mean, it all fits into that, I don't know, collective madness. We've been talking about the mental health of individuals, but I fear for the mental health of the decision makers as a group, our elite, and the fact that they just keep making these terrible choices.
Absolutely. The title San Fransicko refers to the San Fransicness, not just of the drug addicts and the mentally ill on the street, but also the San Fransicness of really all of us, of the society, of progressives, of people in California and these liberal cities. And that really is a kind of compassion sickness. It's a kind of what I ultimately conclude is a pathological altruism, or what Jordan Peterson famously calls the devouring mother. Really, it's the overprotective parenting, it's the coddling culture, it's the victimology. It's not just, and I, at the end of the book, I sort of wrestle with this idea from the great psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who sort of says, look, what progressives are doing is they're taking one value among kind of 6 core values that are core values to most religions. And they're taking one of them, which is care, and they're elevating it above all the other values. I partly agree, but then I think I go a bit further, and I argue that really what progressive ideology, which, I think is rebranded already, really is radical left ideology from Rousseau to Marx to Foucault. What it's done is it's basically said, that each of these traditional values, which include things like sanctity, respect for authority, loyalty, it's redefined each of those values around the victim. So the authority should be to victims, as opposed to, to the government or to God or to the nation or to the parents. The loyalty similarly, and sanctity, the traditional religious views of the body is pure, and you have to be careful what you put into it, and drugs are a problem, not just because of their effect, but because there's a kind of defilement of the body, of the sacred space of the body. Well, progressives take that in a different direction. They would say the body of the victim is also pure, but it's not defiled by drugs. That's okay, because they're just self-medicating. Really, what you have to prevent against is the intrusion upon these pure bodies with the police, with the criminal justice system. And so and I guess I didn't say it before, although maybe it was implied, progressives are strictly focused, or at least very disproportionately focused on victims of the so-called system than they are on victims of other people. And that's why, because one thing you would ask, I did, was, if you're so concerned with victims, why are you not concerned with the 30 times more African Americans killed every year by other civilians rather than the 1/30th killed by the police? And the answer is that progressives, really from a straight line from Rousseau through Marx to Foucault, are just obsessed with victims of the system and not concerned about victims of other individuals.
And I think essentially that really is the true racism, because if you're Black and you find yourself in difficulties, the assumption is there's absolutely nothing you can do to lift yourself out of those difficulties or out of adversity, because the system, as you describe it, manipulated by this oppressor, abstract white figure, that holds the key to your destiny. And so whether you like, being described as a victim is also being put in a place where you're a slave. Again, you can't help it. You can't come out of addiction. You can't get up in the morning and put the effort that's needed to work hard to reestablish your life, to reorganize it, because it's not in your hands.
Yeah, you got it. I think last year you and I may have talked about how we have a mutual friend in Pascal Bruckner, the great French writer, author, and he wrote this brilliant book called Tears of the White Man, which really anticipated wokeism very, very well, but in a more European context, which he noted that, at a moment where African nations are really at a point where they can pursue their own destiny, they're not subjects of European power, they're after, post-colonialism. Well, it's at that moment that suddenly you hear from Europeans how really the fate of Africa is up to Europe, or that the reason that Africa is failing in some ways, African nations might still be failing, is because of Europe. That really, that this discourse finds a way to put, white people at the center of everything. Yeah. So, if you, anytime, so when the classic, when you talk about, challenges facing African Americans among progressives, well, it always has to do, the answers always has to do with racism from white people. So you're right. It's sort of, if you just kind of listen to it, it's really gross, this idea that all Black people are victims and all white people are privileged. Well, it's actually oppressors. It's just oppressors. It's just a reassertion of the thing that we were trying to get away from, and really did, but supposedly in a way that reverses the hierarchy, but it doesn't. It actually reinforces it. So, yeah, I totally agree. It's a kind of narcissism. It's a power move. It's looking to reinforce this older racial hierarchies, supposedly in the name of reversing it, but really reinforces it. One of the things I became obsessed with this, with this great self-help psychologist named Viktor Frankl, who's really a Stoic philosopher, and the idea that, he's famous because he survived the concentration camps by changing his mentality and having goals, including reuniting with his wife and family and writing a book. And so I kind of asked this question, is like, how did liberals go from having this view that, we need to empower people, people need to have the right mentality, to basically claiming that anybody who says that is blaming the victim, and why did that come to take over in the 1960s?
Yeah, I read Viktor Frankl's book. That was an impressive life. I have in my background politics, and so every time I think about societies like the one I came from, Somalia, Kenya, Saudi Arabia, these countries that we call developing countries or authoritarian countries, and I compare them to America and other great European societies. And I think if only we could, in Africa and in the developing world, if only we could find a way of resolving conflict peacefully, then we can become like those rich countries. And that the secret to success, if we stay with America, is that has been discovered, that has been found, it's been applied. We have a government, and power is checked, and it's it's spread. We recognize in America why it's bad for power to be concentrated in the hands of a few. And if you look at what we call now blue states and red states and that sort of thing, one of the things that I find striking is that actually the country is divided now into, if you're a Republican or if you're a conservative, you move to a state run by Republicans. And if you're a Democrat, you move to a blue state. But what that then means is it entrenches this notion of concentrated power. If there was some competition in California, say from the Republican Party, things would be different. I think the politicians would have to be forced to mend their ways. I see a little bit of hope now with the Republican Party and some of the changes that are taking place there, the shedding of Donald Trump, young King, this guy who took Virginia, he comes across as really decent and sane. The Republican Party is investing more time and effort in recruiting people from immigrant communities, Black communities, women, and so on. And so you can see with every election loss, when the Republican Party does an autopsy, then a to-do list comes out of it that they try and follow. I wonder why the Democrats are not doing that.
Well, let's give it a minute. We may see it happen. But
Okay.
you're right. I mean, I think we're in the midst of a very interesting political realignment.
Yeah.
I think one of the big wild cards for Republicans is just, if Trump runs again, and everybody seems to think he will, that will basically close the door to bringing over, I think, some moderate Democrats. But if it's somebody more, like Youngkin, who clearly had appeal among Democrats who voted for Biden, then we're talking about something completely different there. And especially if I mentioned David Shore, the young pollster on the Democratic side. He and others have pointed to the fact that Trump increased his support from Latinos, which is massive. Really on class appeals. Appealing to lower wage Latinos. So if Republicans can become a party truly of the working class without the personality of Trump, I think that opens up a lot of possibilities for it to really be a majority party rather than a minority party. Similarly, though, it's not impossible to imagine some Democrats emerging that take that more moderate approach. Although I agree it's hard because the base of the Democratic Party at this point is just so woke and just, it's really fully in a religious, has a fully religious mentality, viewing climate change as totally apocalyptic, racism, and having supernatural views. I mean, I've been asking my progressive friends why tomorrow I could declare myself a woman and demand total adherence to being called a woman by all of my friends. But if I said I was Black, I would be demonized. And so I think that there's a lot more genetic and biological. I think that my genetics and biology make me much more similar to a Black man than to a white woman. So explain that to me why that is. Well, there is no rational explanation. It's simply that the trans community wants to be larger than it is, and therefore allows anybody who says that they're a different sex to say that. And the African American community, through some peculiarities of history, have sought to, basically not allow and really, in some ways, stigmatize African Americans who are trying to pass themselves off as white or trying to to be acting white or in other ways. So that's just a kind of weird historical coincidence based on the completely arbitrary judgments of activists in both of those communities. It doesn't have anything to do with kind of reality. So you're clearly in a religious mentality. Yeah. I wrote San Fransicko because I was like, it's so ridiculous. Like when I got to the bottom of it, I was like, really, is it really this dumb? And it was like, yep, it's just that dumb. Like I was sort of hoping intellectually on both of these issues, how dumb kind of woke religion is, but then also how straightforward it is to solve the open drug scene problem. And, ultimately at bottom, I'm like, you don't require any fancy intellectual analysis. It's just as dumb as it seems.
Yeah, it is. It's quite dumb. If we look for, across the Atlantic for some hope, what you see is that the Labour Party was ruined by these people with similar views. And of course, and it's no longer Tony Blair's Labour Party that was vibrant and very strong and sane and rational. It's now become something else altogether. This guy called Jeremy Corbyn destroyed it and took on this woke nonsense. And that group, that subset of far, far left, I call them progressives, are still within that party. But if you read the discussion in the newspapers, in the British newspapers, all the rational commentators say a democracy can't survive with just one party. You're then going to get power concentrated in the hands of a few. And I don't think it's good or healthy for a political party to have power so long. And so there are now, I think, very healthy debates and discussions going on within the Labour Party on how to fix this and how to get rid of these crazy, fringe, extreme people who've hijacked the entire party. And I was hoping really that we will see something like that with, one of our major parties, the Democratic Party, unless maybe what other people are pointing to, which is, I don't know, independent party or something like that. But there should be, a democracy can't really survive with one party.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so if you sort of push forward on this, I mean, you could sort of see different paths. I mean, one of them, obviously, the future of the Republican Party depends heavily on whether or not Trump gets the nomination.
Yeah.
If he doesn't, then I think that the party has a chance to become a majority party.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then it seems to me that we're looking at a very similar realignment of the kind that we saw under Reagan. Though I think the difference is that it's not a neoliberal realignment like Reagan ushered in. It's really more of a nationalist, like more of an economic nationalist one that probably has an expanded role for the state. That is, Republicans no longer trying to privatize entitlements, for example, and being, pretty accepting and open towards gays and lesbians. I don't know what happens with abortion under either scenario. Democrats, I would say if there's a third party that has any possibility, it would be in California. We have an open primary system already, so you can have 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans in the runoff, or independents. But I think that depends on, what, again, here too, it just depends on the candidates that you get to some extent. What's interesting is if you did get a third party in California, whether it would be aligned with one of the parties outside of California, or whether it would take it over. A lot of big questions to ask. I mean, it seems like, certainly in California, there's a lot of unhappiness. Somebody's got to emerge, to challenge Gavin Newsom, somebody more moderate. On the one hand, on the other hand, the Republican Party is basically dead. It's very hard to raise the kind of money you need to raise to compete with a Gavin Newsom. More likely would be, though, that moderate Democrats take back power in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and Gavin ends up governing more as a moderate if he's reelected.
Yeah. Well, I hope that there is a scenario where he can be successfully challenged, because again, it's really only through the ballot box that we will be able to see a peaceful transition to a more normal life. And I think Virginia has shown that. I think what we also see in Virginia is, I was cheering on this woman, Winsome Sears, last night. That's a Black woman, I think originally from Jamaica. She was elected to the position of Lieutenant General. And she stood there saying, please it's not about my skin. And this country has given me all these wonderful things. And she said, what did she say? Like a little bit away from becoming the governor. And I think that if you have more and more individuals like that, instead of a Trump, but more and more people with that kind of background, Latinos, other immigrants, taking prominent positions in the Republican Party, they do have a winning chance. And then I think
agree.
That also takes that race argument and that race narrative out, just tosses that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think there's real potential there. It's interesting. I mean, I'm struck by how quickly and how responsive our political system is. I mean, there's some people that still kind of say, oh, the elites are out of touch. I think that's true. But when they suffer a defeat like this, I just kind of go, I don't know. I mean, Democrats can just keep losing. But if the Democrats were to keep losing so badly, then, yeah, you would have some sort of new party, challenge them. I think the other thing that we all worry about, right, is that basically we just become more segregated, so that states like California become one-party states. Other states become, Republican one-party states. I think what's exciting about Virginia is it shows that you can get a candidate who was, not expected, is really the underdog candidate, not expected to make any headway, who can come and win, in part because he doesn't have the abrasive qualities of a Trump, who, I think in the past would have had a more neoliberal orientation. I think he comes out of the finance sector, but was able to strike a more populist chord. So yeah, clearly we're seeing some innovation there. I think that, there's going to need to be a proper reckoning on the Democratic side with what the agenda is. In California, I kind of look at what their Democrats are proposing nationally, childcare credits, is the big one, some subsidies for renewables. And I'm like, that doesn't address any of the big issues in California. We're in the midst of a bad drug addiction, untreated mental illness crisis. And yet what's the strategy on either of those is totally not clear.
Right.
So, but I think that goes to Republicans too. I mean, during the recall election, Larry Elder, who was the main Republican candidate, he didn't really have a particularly good answer, a good story on what do you do about homelessness and drug addiction. There was some hand waving, but he also said things like, it was confusing because he would say, we need to decriminalize all drugs.
Yeah.
At the same time, he said, oh, we got to have charities involved in taking care of addicts. That's just not good enough. I mean, he really needed a more serious proposal. Yeah. It was interesting to me last night when I was watching Youngkin from Virginia give his acceptance speech. He said something like, and we're going to invest in behavioral health. And I felt like, wow, that is like a big piece of wonkery for your acceptance speech. But it shows that, but behavioral health is very, avant-garde language to describe what we used to call mental health, or basically, behaviors that are affected by addiction or mental illness. Yeah. Using very progressive, and that's like using very progressive wonky language to describe something similar. But yeah, if you had someone that was more like a Youngkin than a Larry Elder, who's out there, pretty progressive on a bunch of things, including healthcare, including, probably in California, they've got to be pro-abortion rights, but again, that's hard because so much of the Republican base in California is actually quite similar to the Trump base in the rest of the country.
Yeah. I noticed that. I think the problem also with mental health is the definition of mental health has become so elastic. So you were talking about schizophrenia the other moment, and that falls under mental health. But also what Meghan Markle suffers from also falls under mental health. So if you have a definition that's that wide, you'll just be wasting resources, really.
What does Meghan Markle say she suffers from?
Search me.
Narcissism?
Yeah. So I think a lot of
entitlement, extreme entitlement and narcissism with some neuroticism built into it, I guess. Come on, guys. That's pathetic.
But that is the problem. So if that's mental health, which she has is mental health, and then you have people who are psychotic either on drugs or because of their genes and are really violent, veterans from the military with proper PTSD trauma, where do where's the cutoff?
One of the questions I was wrestling with in San Francisco that we wrestled with as a staff was sort of, is the universal healthcare proposal that we're proposing, is it just for the really down and out, the people on the streets, the people suffering really bad illness? Ultimately, we think we need universal mental health statewide, because before people get to the point where they're on the street, there are kids experimenting with drugs. They need, often this is it's not my argument, but I agree. There's a lot of people that are self-medicating.
Yeah.
And so you see people that, young people that would have benefited from an antidepressant or maybe an ADHD drug, or, that plus some therapy and a job and some counseling would be fine. One of the things is that, the argument by Sally Satel, who's one of the people that blurbed my book, psychiatrist at American Enterprise Institute, she just argues the opioid crisis, you have to, yes, the drug companies were terrible and they weren't regulated properly and all that stuff. And yes, loneliness and despair, all those things are factors, but we just didn't provide proper psychiatric care for people suffering from some highly treatable mental illness. I mean, antidepressants are miracle drugs, but we have a pretty good, I mean, it's not perfect, but we have pretty good drugs for people, good medicines for people, but they need to see a psychiatrist. The great thing is telepsych now means that should not be super expensive. You don't need to go see a psychiatrist every week. Most people don't, at least not for long periods of time. Mm-hmm. So when you ask about costs, like one way you bring down the costs is you help people to get the care that they need. They're seeing a psychiatrist because that's the most expensive part of the system is the psychiatrist because they're MDs. But, most people, they maybe just need to get their medicines. They need to tweak it a little bit over some time, but then they're going to be okay with exercise, therapy, diet, job, relationships, the typical ingredients of a happy life. And I think you can end up avoiding a lot of the expensive costs later. But again, you've got to have a society that understands, and this is where the Dutch are brilliant, that it does require carrots and sticks. It does require discipline, and that the Beatles were wrong. Love is not all we need.
Yeah. Well, I could listen to you all day long. And even though we're talking about some of these grave issues, you always give me hope. So Michael, thank you so much.
It's wonderful to speak with you again, and it's always a pleasure. Let's keep the conversation going.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of the Ayaan Hirsi Ali podcast. I hope you're enjoying these conversations as much as I am. Visit ayaanhirsiali.com to learn more and consider subscribing to support this podcast. As always, I'm looking forward to the next conversation.